In the sweltering late summer of 1886, a man whose very presence seemed to dampen the air around him stepped off a locomotive at a bustling Chicago station. He introduced himself to the world as Dr. H. Holmes. But this was merely the first of many masks worn by Herman Webster Mudgett. Chicago, at that time, was a chaotic masterpiece of the Industrial Revolution, a city built on blood, steel, and unbridled ambition. It was a place where thousands arrived daily, seeking to disappear or reinvent themselves, making it the perfect hunting ground for a man who viewed human beings as nothing more than biological specimens. Holmes possessed a terrifyingly calm demeanor. His piercing blue eyes were often described as cold and unblinking, like those of a bird of prey. He moved through the crowded streets of Englewood not as a participant, but as a silent observer, calculating the weaknesses of a society he was about to exploit. He quickly secured a position at a local pharmacy, charming the elderly owner and her husband so completely that, when they eventually vanished without a trace, the neighbors simply accepted Holmes's explanation that they had moved to California. This was the beginning of a dark empire. He didn't just want to exist in Chicago. He wanted to dominate the very fabric of the city's life, weaving a web of lies, debt, and death that would eventually entangle hundreds. Directly across from the pharmacy, Holmes began the gargantuan task of constructing a three-story building that the locals would come to call the Castle. On the surface, it was meant to be a commercial marvel, a hotel to house the influx of tourists for the upcoming World's Fair. However, the blueprints of this structure were a chaotic reflection of Holmes's own fractured psyche. To ensure his dark secrets remained hidden, Holmes employed a revolving door of contractors and laborers. He would hire a crew to build a specific wing, then fire them weeks later without pay, claiming their work was inferior. This strategic turnover meant that no single person, other than Holmes himself, ever grasped the building's full, terrifying layout. The castle was a masterpiece of architectural insanity. Hallways led to nowhere, stairs ended abruptly at the ceiling, and doors opened to reveal solid brick walls or 20-foot drops into the dark abyss of the cellar. It was a labyrinth designed to disorient and trap, a physical manifestation of a mind that had entirely abandoned the concept of human empathy. Every nail driven into the wood, every brick laid in the mortar, was a step toward creating a factory of death that operated in the heart of a residential neighborhood, hidden in plain sight under the guise of progress. As the 1893 World's Fair, known as the White City, opened its gates, Chicago became a beacon of light and electricity for the entire world. It was a celebration of human achievement, but in its long, flickering shadows, H. Holmes was preparing his own grim festivities. Millions of travelers, particularly young, independent women who had left their small-town lives for the promise of urban freedom, flocked to the city. Holmes targeted these women with surgical precision. He offered them employment, affordable lodging, and, most lethally, his undivided attention. To these newcomers, he was the personification of the American dream, a handsome, successful doctor who offered safety in a strange city. They entered the World's Fair Hotel, with their trunks packed with dreams and their hearts full of hope, never suspecting that the man holding the ledger was their executioner. The contrast was stark. While the rest of the world looked toward the future in the White City, Holmes was dragging his victims back into a primordial darkness. He greeted each guest with a practiced smile, but those who looked closely noticed that his warmth was a performance, a hollow shell, designed to lure the unwary into a tomb from which there was no exit. Once the heavy doors of the murder castle clicked shut behind a guest, they entered a realm where the laws of nature and logic seemed to fail. The interior was a claustrophobic nightmare of narrow passages and soundproof chambers. Holmes had designed the building with a series of secret panels and peepholes, allowing him to stalk his guests from within the very walls. Imagine the psychological horror of a guest trying to leave their room in the middle of the night, only to find that the door handle was a dummy, and the only exit was a sliding panel controlled by a man in another room. The corridors were intentionally narrow to induce panic, and the lighting was kept dim to hide the various traps. There were rooms with no windows and rooms with multiple doors that all led to the same central, inescapable hallway. It was a giant, wouldn't trap a living organism that Holmes manipulated like a puppet master. He would often watch his victims for hours, enjoying their confusion and growing terror as they realized that the hotel was not a place of rest, but a predatory cage. The sheer effort required to design such a complex system of disorientation speaks to a level of calculated malice that is almost unparalleled in criminal history. Among the many guest rooms in the castle, several were fitted with a feature that transformed them into high-tech execution chambers. These rooms were lined with iron plates and heavy asbestos to ensure they were completely soundproof, and the doors were reinforced with heavy bolts. Hidden within the walls was a complex network of gas lines, all of which terminated in Holmes's private office. From his desk, Holmes could turn a series of brass valves to flood any specific room with lethal gas. He didn't always choose to kill quickly. Sometimes he would release just enough gas to make the victims drowsy and confused, prolonging their agony and his own perverse enjoyment. He would sit in the silence of his office, sometimes for entire nights, listening to the muffled thumping and scratching against the walls as his victims realized their air was being replaced by poison. This was death on an industrial scale, removed from the passion of a typical crime. To Holmes, it was a mechanical process, as simple as operating a machine in a factory. The victims were not people to him. They were variables in an experiment on human suffering, conducted in a silence so profound that the bustling city, just feet away, never heard a single plea for mercy. If the upper floors were designed for the hunt, the basement was designed for the processing. Beneath the floorboards of Englewood lay a cellar that would eventually be described by police as a slaughterhouse. It was a cavernous, dark space filled with the tools of a macabre trade. There were massive acid vats, large enough to dissolve a human body within hours, and pits filled with quicklime to accelerate the decomposition of flesh. Holmes had even installed a high-temperature furnace capable of cremating remains without leaving a trace of ash. To facilitate the movement of bodies, he had built grease chutes that ran from the upper execution rooms directly to the basement floor. Once a victim had perished, Holmes would use his medical expertise to dissect them. He was a man of cold, hard efficiency. He realized that while a whole body was evidence, a skeleton was a commodity. He would meticulously clean the bones of his victims, articulating them into professional medical skeletons, which he then sold to universities and doctors across the country. In his mind, he wasn't just a killer. He was a businessman who had found a way to monetize death itself, turning the ultimate human tragedy into a profitable, recurring revenue stream. Holmes's greatest weapon was not his gas chambers or his acid vats, but his uncanny ability to manipulate the human spirit. He was a polymath of deceit, capable of playing any role required to achieve his goals. To his multiple wives, he was a devoted, albeit mysterious, husband. To his business associates, he was a brilliant, if eccentric, entrepreneur. He was a master of insurance fraud, often staging elaborate accidents to collect payouts. He would convince his employees to take out large life insurance policies, with him as the beneficiary, only for those employees to vanish shortly thereafter. His charm was so potent that he could talk his way out of almost any confrontation with creditors or suspicious family members of the missing. He operated in an era before fingerprints, background checks, or interconnected police departments, exploiting the inherent trust of a Victorian society that could not conceive of a man so educated and refined being a cold-blooded monster. He understood the social cues of the elite and used them to camouflage his predatory nature, proving that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who dress in fine suits and speak with the most eloquent tongues. Benjamin Petezel was more than just an employee. He was Holmes's right-hand man, a fixer who helped facilitate many of the doctor's financial scams. However, in the cold world of H.H. Holmes, loyalty was a one-way street. Holmes devised a plan to defraud an insurance company by faking Petezel's death, using a cadaver as a substitute. In reality, Holmes saw an opportunity to remove a witness and collect the full payout. He murdered Petezel in Philadelphia, making it look like a tragic lab accident involving explosives. The horror deepened when Holmes took custody of 3 of Petezel's children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, promising their mother he was taking them to see their father. What followed was a sickening cross-country journey where Holmes played a cat-and-mouse game with the grieving widow, moving the children from city to city while she followed just days behind. One by one, he murdered the children as they became a burden to his travel plans. He killed the 2 girls in a rental house in Toronto and the young boy in Indianapolis, disposing of them in the same cold, methodical manner he had used in his Chicago castle. This was the act that would finally shatter his mask and bring the full weight of the law upon him. The downfall of the Beast of Chicago was not brought about by a grand police raid, but by the tireless investigative work of a single man, Frank Dare, a detective with the Pinkerton Agency. Dare was tasked with locating the missing Petezel children. He possessed a relentless, almost obsessive drive to uncover the truth. Dare retraced Holmes's steps across the United States and Canada, visiting every boarding house, rental property, and hotel where Holmes had stayed with the children. It was a grueling, heart-wrenching search that involved interviewing hundreds of people and searching through the basements of several properties. His breakthrough came in Toronto, where he noticed a patch of disturbed earth in a cellar. Digging with his own hands, he uncovered the remains of the Petezel girls. Dare's work was a pioneer in what we now call criminal profiling and forensic investigation. He didn't just find bodies, he reconstructed Holmes's psychological movements, proving that the doctor was not just a fraudster, but a child killer of the most depraved sort. Dare's determination ensured that Holmes could no longer hide behind his web of aliases and lies, dragging the monster from the shadows of his own making and into the cold light of justice. When the Chicago police finally executed a search warrant on the building in Englewood, they were prepared for evidence of financial crimes, but they were utterly blindsided by the architectural horror they encountered. As they moved through the World's Fair Hotel, they began to find the secret rooms, the sliding panels, and the ironclad gas chambers. The investigators were physically sickened by the stagnant odor of rot that permeated the walls. When they descended into the basement, the true scale of the horror became clear. They found human teeth embedded in the furnace, jewelry belonging to dozens of missing women, and piles of bone fragments mixed with quicklime. The local community, which had seen the building as a sign of progress, was paralyzed by the realization that they had been living next to a professional slaughterhouse. The raid turned into a multi-week forensic excavation, as police literally tore the building apart to find the hidden compartments where Holmes had stashed his grisly trophies. The castle was no longer a hotel. It was a crime scene of such magnitude that it remains one of the most studied locations in the history of American criminology. Dr. Samuel Harding, a medical professional who observed Holmes during his subsequent imprisonment and trial, noted a terrifying quality in the man's eyes, a total absence of what he called the human spark. Holmes did not kill out of rage, lust, or even desperation. He killed out of a cold, clinical curiosity. He was a man of the Enlightenment gone horribly wrong, using the tools of science and medicine to explore the boundaries of death. During his time in Chicago, he would often keep subject journals where he documented the physiological responses of his victims to different levels of gas or physical trauma. To Holmes, a human life was merely a collection of organs and chemical reactions to be studied and dismantled. This detached, scientific approach to murder is what makes him a uniquely modern monster. He didn't see himself as evil. He saw himself as a researcher, and his victims as the laboratory animals required for his studies. This total dehumanization allowed him to operate for years without a hint of guilt, proving that the most dangerous form of evil is the one that convinces itself it is merely being rational. While awaiting his execution in a Philadelphia prison, Holmes began to write his confessions, which were later sold to the Hearst newspapers for a staggering sum. In these writings, he claimed responsibility for 27 murders, though he described many more incidents that suggested a death toll in the hundreds. His prose was chillingly articulate, devoid of remorse or any plea for forgiveness. He spoke of his childhood, claiming he was born with the devil in him, and recounted an early memory of being forced to touch a skeleton in a doctor's office to cure his fear of death, an event he claimed sparked his lifelong obsession. However, Holmes was a compulsive liar until the end. His confessions were a mixture of gruesome truth and elaborate fantasy, designed to maintain his notoriety and manipulate public perception even from death row. He even claimed that his face was beginning to take on a satanic appearance, asserting that his features were elongating and his ears were becoming pointed. Whether he truly believed this or was simply putting on one last performance, his confession cemented his place as America's first celebrity serial killer, a man who understood that, in the eyes of the public, infamy was just as valuable as fame. The trial of H. Holmes was a cultural event that gripped the entire nation, serving as a precursor to the true crime obsession of the modern era. The courtroom in Philadelphia was packed daily with journalists, curious onlookers, and legal experts who wanted to see the man who had turned a hotel into a tomb. Holmes, ever the narcissist, insisted on participating in his own defense, frequently cross-examining witnesses with a chillingly polite and professional tone. He seemed to relish the attention, treating the trial not as a fight for his life, but as a stage for his final performance. However, the evidence presented by the prosecution, particularly the forensic findings from the Petzel murders and the horrifying artifacts from the Chicago castle, was overwhelming. The testimony of Frank Eyre, who detailed the discovery of the children's bodies, was so powerful that it reportedly moved several jurors to tears. Holmes's charm finally failed him in the face of such undeniable physical proof of his depravity. He was found guilty of murder in the first degree, a verdict that was met with a sense of collective relief from a public that had been terrified by the details of his murder castle for months. In the final months leading up to his execution, Holmes's psychological state became an object of intense fascination for prison doctors and the press. He began to claim that he was physically transforming into a demon. He wrote letters to his lawyers and the newspapers asserting that the evil spirit within him was finally manifesting in his flesh. He claimed his skull was changing shape and that his skin was taking on an unnatural grayish pallor. Prison guards reported that Holmes would spend hours staring into a small mirror in his cell, talking to himself and tracing the lines of his face with his fingers. Whether this was a genuine psychotic break or a final, calculated attempt to avoid the gallows by appearing insane, it added a dark, almost supernatural layer to the H. Holmes legend. It suggested that he wasn't just a man who did bad things, but a man who had entirely surrendered his soul to something primordial. This transformation served to distance him further from humanity, making him an object of pure horror in the eyes of the public, a creature that had to be destroyed to restore the moral order of the world. On the morning of May 7, 1896, the long journey of H. Holmes came to a silent, abrupt end at Philadelphia's Moyamensing prison. To the very last second, he maintained his eerie composure. He walked to the gallows with a steady gait, showing no signs of the satanic transformation he had claimed. He even chatted politely with the executioner, thanking him for his consideration and helping him adjust the hood. His final request was a strange testament to his own fear of death. He asked that his coffin be filled with cement and buried 10 feet deep. He was terrified that medical students or resurrection men would dig up his body to perform an autopsy or display his skeleton, much as he had done to his own victims. It was a final, supreme irony. A man who had dissected dozens was desperate to keep his own remains untouched. When the trapdoor finally opened, Holmes didn't die instantly. His neck failed to break, and he struggled for over 15 minutes before his heart finally stopped. It was a slow, agonizing end that many in the witness gallery felt was a fitting conclusion for a man who had built a monument to prolonged suffering. Not long after Holmes's execution, a mysterious event occurred that seemed to signal the final erasure of his evil from the physical world. In the middle of a hot August night, several massive explosions ripped through the murder castle in Englewood. Within minutes, the entire 3-story labyrinth was engulfed in a fire of such intensity that firemen from across the city could do nothing but watch it burn. While the official cause was never determined, many believed it was an act of arson committed by the local residents. A purification of the neighborhood to ensure the building could never be used as a museum or a shrine to Holmes's crimes. Some even whispered that the building had been haunted by the cries of the vanished. and that the fire was a form of spiritual release. The site remained a charred, vacant lot for decades, a hole in the city's geography that seemed to repel any new development. It wasn't until much later that a post office was built on the site. But even today, employees report hearing strange sounds and feeling a lingering sense of dread in the basement, a reminder that some shadows are too deep to be cleared away by fire or time. The case of H. Holmes permanently altered the American collective consciousness, shattering the Victorian illusion of safety and progress. Before Holmes, the term serial killer had not yet entered the common vocabulary, and the public generally believed that monsters were easy to spot, disturbed individuals who lived on the fringes of society. Holmes proved that the most terrifying predators could be refined, educated, and integrated into the very heart of a community. He turned the bustling excitement of the 1893 World's Fair into a cautionary tale about the dangers of the modern, anonymous city. His crimes led to significant changes in how the legal system handled interstate crime and helped establish the Pinkerton Agency as a legitimate investigative force. But his true legacy is more psychological. He represents the birth of the American psycho, a figure that continues to dominate our media and fiction. He taught us that evil doesn't always wear a monstrous face. Sometimes it wears a tailored suit, carries a medical degree, and welcomes you into its home with a warm, inviting smile that hides a cold, calculating heart. One of the most tragic aspects of the H. Holmes story is the number of victims whose names and stories have been lost to history because Holmes targeted drifters, travelers, and young women who had severed ties with their families to seek independence. Many disappearances were never reported. In the chaos of the World's Fair, people went missing every day, and Holmes exploited this anonymity to its fullest extent. Historians estimate that while Holmes was convicted of only one murder and confessed to 27, the true number of lives he took in his Chicago castle and during his travels could exceed 200. These nameless victims were cremated in his furnace or dissolved in his acid vats, their remains becoming part of the very soil of Chicago. They were people with dreams, fears, and futures that were extinguished in a dark, soundless room for no reason other than one man's curiosity. Today, they are remembered only as statistics in a true crime narrative, a somber reminder that the scale of human evil often exceeds our ability to document it. Their ghosts remain the true foundation of the murder castle legend, haunting the archives of a city that still hasn't fully accounted for all its lost souls. Modern criminal profiling and psychology owe a great deal to the study of H. Holmes. He is often cited as the archetypal organized serial killer, one who is highly intelligent, socially competent, and capable of elaborate planning and concealment. Holmes didn't suffer from a lack of logic. He suffered from a total lack of conscience, a condition we now define as psychopathy. He possessed what psychologists call the mask of sanity, the ability to mimic human emotions so perfectly that he could deceive even trained professionals. He understood the mechanics of social interaction and used them to his advantage, but he felt no actual bond to any other living creature. To Holmes, people were objects to be used, and murder was simply a form of resource management. His ability to lead a double or triple life, maintaining multiple families and businesses while operating a slaughterhouse, demonstrates a level of cognitive compartmentalization that is both fascinating and horrifying. He remains the gold standard for studying the calculated predator, a figure that reminds us that the human brain, when stripped of its moral compass, can become the most dangerous machine on the planet. As we stand in the present and look back at the dark shadow of H. Holmes, we are forced to confront uncomfortable truths about our own nature and history. The murder castle is gone, replaced by the mundane architecture of a modern post office, but the questions it raised about human depravity remain as relevant as ever. Holmes reminds us that civilization is a thin veneer, and that the same tools we use for progress, architecture, medicine, commerce, can be twisted into tools of absolute horror. His story is not just a tale of a bad man, it is a study of how a predator can exploit the gaps in our trust and our social structures. As you walk through any large, modern city today, with its tall buildings and anonymous crowds, Remember the story of Englewood. Remember that behind the grandest facades and the most charming smiles, there can exist secrets that science and humanity can never fully explain. The case of Timothy Caldwell and H. Holmes teaches us that evil is not a relic of the past. It is a permanent part of the human condition, a shadow that walks beside us, waiting for the right moment to invite us in. Lock the door and turn the dial.